The palace grounds were silent, save for the soft hiss of the wind through the cypress trees. Beneath a blood-red dawn, the towering domes and slender minarets of Istanbul's skyline loomed like spectres over the city below. Inside the Topkapi Palace walls, a different kind of storm brewed, a storm of ambition, fear, and ruthless calculation. Here, in the shadowed chambers of power, the fate of empires was sealed with whispers and with blood. Picture it, a boy barely into manhood, seated upon a throne of gold and silk, trembling beneath the weight of a crown that brought not only power, but mortal peril. The air is heavy with incense, and the eyes of hardened viziers and steely-eyed janissaries bore into him, awaiting his first command. And he knows, as all heirs of the Ottoman dynasty knew, that to rule was to kill or be killed. This is the chilling reality behind the splendor of the Ottoman Empire, a system where brothers were bound not by love, but by a shared destiny to destroy or be destroyed. This is the story of why Ottoman sultans killed their own bloodhound. Fratricide became law, ritual, and necessity in one of history's most powerful empires. To understand the horrors that unfolded in these palace walls, we must first journey back to the birth of the empire itself. The Ottoman state emerged in the late 13th century, a frontier beylik rising from the ashes of a crumbling Seljuk world. From their humble beginnings in Anatolia, the Osmanli rulers carved out a realm that soon spanned 3 continents. By the 15th century, their banners flew over the ruins of Byzantium, their ships dominated the seas, and their armies terrified Europe and Persia alike. Yet with this meteoric rise came a terrible problem, one that would plague the dynasty for centuries: succession. Unlike the kingdoms of Europe, the Ottoman throne was not bound by primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited by default. Instead, all sons of the sultan had a claim to the throne. In theory, this offered flexibility. In practice, it unleashed cycles of bloodshed that stained the dynasty's history darker than any conquest. Consider the chaos that followed the death of Sultan Bayezid I at the start of the 15th century. His sons plunged the empire into civil war, the so-called Ottoman interregnum, a decade of brother fighting brother, city burning city, as the empire teetered on the edge of ruin. This nightmare burned into the minds of future sultans, a grim lesson: a dead brother is better than a divided empire. Thus, fratricide, the killing of royal siblings, became a chilling instrument of statecraft. By the reign of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, it was no longer simply a grim choice in times of crisis. It was policy. Mehmed's legal code, the Kanun name, formalized it in cold, brutal language. Whichever of my sons inherits the sultanate, it is acceptable for him to kill his brothers for the common good. Most jurists have approved this. Let action be taken accordingly. These were not empty words. The marble corridors of Topkapi Palace would soon echo with the footfalls of executioners, the silent sobs of mothers, and the final gasps of princes too young to wield a sword, yet old enough to threaten a sultan's grip on power. Imagine the fear that gripped the harem and the inner palace upon a sultan's death. The sultan's sons, some born to concubines, others to favored wives, knew that their father's last breath was the signal for their own struggle to begin. Loyal factions of janissaries, viziers, and palace guards would swiftly pick a side, ushering their chosen prince to the throne while hunting down his rivals. In those frantic hours, brothers became enemies, and the corridors of the palace transformed into rivers of betrayal and blood. One of the most haunting examples comes from the reign of Sultan Selim I, known as Selim the Grim. Upon ascending the throne in 1512, he ordered the execution of his brothers and nephews, some mere infants, ensuring that no rival claim could fracture his rule. His reign would go on to expand the empire dramatically, but it began in a bath of blood that few could forget. This was not an aberration, but the new normal. From Mehmed II to Murad III, fratricide became part of the unspoken ritual of succession. Young princes, once playmates in the palace gardens, were strangled with silken cords in the dead of night, their bodies wrapped in carpets and taken away in silence. No sultan could risk mercy, for mercy bred rebellion. And yet, this system created its own horrors. The mothers of these doomed princes lived in terror, powerless to protect their sons. The palace staff, executioners included, became instruments of a cycle that deformed the soul of the empire. And the sultans themselves? They bore the weight of these acts, their rule forever shadowed by the blood of their kin. In this first chapter of our journey, we have seen the birth of an empire and the seeds of a system where blood ties offered no protection, where the price of peace was often the life of a brother. But in part 2, we will delve deeper into the intrigues that fueled these fratricidal acts, the rebellions that made them seem inevitable, and the dark rivalries that turned brothers into executioners. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of power, fear, and fatal ambition at the heart of the Ottoman dynasty. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its glory, stretched across the lands of 3 continents, its banners casting long shadows over the Balkans, the Levant, North Africa, and deep into the heart of Arabia. Its sultans commanded fleets that ruled the seas and armies that humbled kings. Yet beneath the majesty of domes and the might of legions, the empire trembled not from its enemies beyond the frontiers, but from the storm that always threatened within: rebellion, betrayal, and the deadly dance of fratricide. It was a system built on strength, but one that feared weakness above all. From the moment a sultan ascended the throne, he became both the master of the empire and the prisoner of its brutal code of survival. His first test was not the conquest of distant lands, but the quiet, bloody task of securing his power at home. And at the heart of that task lay his brother's princes who, by mere existence, posed a threat greater than any foreign army. Consider the empire's own lessons. Time and again, whenever a sultan hesitated, the result was civil war. When Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 captured by Tamerlane, his sons descended into chaos. The Ottoman interregnum that followed was not a war against outside forces, but a nightmare of brother against brother. For over a decade, princes fought for the throne, armies clashed across Anatolia, cities burned, and the empire itself nearly collapsed. This disaster seared itself into the memory of the dynasty. Never again could a sultan allow his brothers to live and risk another interregnum. And so, what had once been a desperate measure became law, custom, ritual. The empire's survival, it was believed, depended on swift and merciless action. Yet this grim logic did not end the danger. For every brother killed, another faction formed. The court itself was a nest of serpents, viziers, pashas, janissary commanders, eunuchs, and mothers of princes, each with ambitions of their own. The harem, far from being a place of idle pleasure, was a battlefield in silk and shadow. There, concubines vied for favor, not simply for themselves, but for their sons, for in the Ottoman world, to bear the heir was to wield unimaginable influence. At the center of this struggle was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was often the most powerful woman in the empire, the silent force behind the throne. But for every Valide who rose, there were many more mothers who watched, helpless, as their sons were led to the bowstring. Picture the court of Sultan Murad III. His reign, like so many others, was marked by splendor and slaughter. When he ascended the throne in 1574, the harem wept not in joy but in dread. Murad, following the custom of his forebears, ordered the execution of his 5 younger brothers. The princes were strangled, their bodies carried from the palace in secret, their names erased from history's pages except as footnotes to fratricide. But why did the bloodletting continue century after century? Because the alternative was considered far worse. A single surviving brother, backed by ambitious pashas or discontented janissaries, could spark rebellion that would plunge the empire into civil war. And with the Ottoman state positioned between hostile powers, the Habsburgs to the west, the Safavids to the east, such a war could prove fatal. Even with fratricide, the danger was never far. The janissaries themselves, the elite corps sworn to protect the Sultan, became a source of instability. At times they turned on their master, deposing sultans, elevating others, or simply demanding greater power. A discontented janissary corps was as dangerous as any rival prince. And then there were the provincial governors, the beys and pashas, who ruled in the Sultan's name but often with ambitions of their own. In times of weak rule, these men became power brokers, choosing sides in succession struggles, backing one prince against another, and tearing the empire apart from within. The history of the Ottoman Fratricide is therefore not a tale of cold-blooded cruelty alone. It is the story of a state fighting for survival in an age of intrigue, conspiracy, and constant peril. Every execution was a brutal calculation, sacrifice the few to save the many, shed family blood to preserve the empire's future. And so the cycle fed itself. Each rebellion, each attempted coup, each civil war served as justification for further killings. The sultans became prisoners of their own paranoia, caught in a web where trust was impossible, mercy dangerous, and family ties a curse rather than a bond. It was not just brothers who died. The ripple effects spread outward. Loyal servants executed on suspicion of divided loyalties, concubines poisoned for imagined plots, even grand viziers removed at the first hint of disobedience. The court became a theater of fear, where every gesture, every word might be read as treason. Yet the people of the empire saw only the surface. The grand processions, the glittering ceremonies, the mighty armies marching beneath banners of the crescent and star. Few outside the palace walls knew the full cost of that splendor. The silent bodies buried in unmarked graves, the mothers' laments muffled by the hum of state machinery, the constant dread that haunted every air. In Part 2, we have explored the dark intrigues, rebellions, and betrayals that made fratricide seem not just acceptable but necessary. But in Part 3, we will step closer to the horror itself. We will enter the inner palace, witness the preparations for execution, and see how the machinery of death turned against the empire's own blood. Join us as we pass through the gilded gates into the shadows where sultans secured their power, one brother at a time. The morning air in Istanbul was heavy with the scent of the Bosphorus, but inside the Topkapi Palace, that salty breeze never reached. The walls were too thick, the windows too small, the corridors too labyrinthine, and in those shadowed passages, the machinery of fratricide stirred to life. It began not with the executioner's cord, but with the Sultan's silent decision. A decision made not in anger, not in haste, but with the cold certainty that to rule, one must first erase all threats, even those who shared one's blood. The order was given with a nod, a glance, or a whispered word, and from that instant the fates of royal brothers were sealed. Picture a young prince, perhaps no older than 16, still clad in the silks of the harem, still dreaming of hunts, poetry, and the gardens of the palace. He wakes to the soft footfalls of guards, to the glint of steel in the half-light. There is no trial, no farewell, no appeal, only the knowledge that his time has come, that the very empire his father built has decreed his death for its own survival. The chosen instruments of death were as symbolic as they were practical. A bowstring, a silken cord, a sash of the finest weave tools that, in theory, spared the royal body the dishonor of shedding blood. Strangulation became the method of choice, a ritual of fratricide polished over generations. Blood was for traitors and rebels. Brothers died in silence, by silk and cord. But before the cord tightened, there was the preparation, a choreography of dread that played out behind closed doors. The inner palace, or enderun, was the stage. Guards loyal to the Sultan formed a cordon through which no one could pass without permission. The chief black eunuch, or Kislar Aga, often oversaw the grim business. His face betrayed nothing, his voice gave no comfort. He was a man entrusted with the most terrible secrets of the dynasty and the most necessary cruelties. The condemned princes were kept under house arrest within their chambers. Sometimes they had no idea their end approached. Other times they knew and waited, each footstep outside their door a possible herald of doom. Meanwhile, the executioners prepared. These men, often mute or deaf, were selected to minimize the risk of secrets escaping. They were well-fed, well-paid, and well-feared servants of the Sultan's will, invisible but ever-present. They handled their silk cords as a craftsman might handle his finest tool, for their work required precision. A quick death was a mercy, a botched execution invited haunting, both of conscience and of court. The setting of the act varied. Some princes were killed in their chambers, the cords slipped around their throats as they rose from sleep or knelt in prayer. Others were taken to secluded halls, quiet rooms with no witnesses, save for the guards who sealed the doors. The walls of these rooms absorbed generations of final gasps, and the floors bore the weight of bodies laid out in silence before being carried away. Outside, the city awoke to the sound of muezzins calling the faithful to prayer. Merchants opened their stalls. Fishermen cast their nets. Life continued, oblivious to the royal blood spilling within the palace. The Ottoman Empire was expert at hiding its horrors behind a facade of order, faith, and majesty. But within the palace walls, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The women of the harem wept in secret, knowing that the death of a son, a brother, a beloved prince could come at any moment. The mothers of the condemned were powerless, no matter their rank. Even the Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, could do little once her son had chosen to wield the bowstring. And the sultan himself? In the hours before the executions, he would retreat into solitude, bearing the crushing weight of his decision. For while fratricide was law, custom, and necessity, it was also a wound that every sultan carried within him, a scar that no crown could hide. One of the most haunting preparations for fratricide took place upon the accession of Sultan Mehmed III in 1595. It is said that upon his father's death, Mehmed ordered the immediate execution of his 19 brothers. 19 boys and young men, some mere infants, strangled one by one so that their brother might rule unchallenged. The courtyards of Topkapi ran silent that day, but the grief that followed was deafening within the harem. The empire gained a sultan, the dynasty lost a generation. And the city? The city saw only the spectacle of a new ruler ascending the throne, a procession of grandeur, a shower of gold coins, a feast for the janissaries. The cost in blood was hidden, locked behind the gilded gates of the palace. The bodies of the princes were handled with a terrible care. Wrapped in fine cloth, their faces covered, they were borne out through hidden passages, laid to rest in quiet tombs, their names carved in stone without mention of how their lives had ended. The official chroniclers recorded the accession of the sultan, the loyalty of the janissaries, the prayers of the people, but not the stranglings in the dark. That was the empire's secret, and one that all were bound to keep. And so, in Part 3, we have entered the palace at the hour of death, seen the preparations for royal fratricide, and felt the heavy silence that preceded the tightening of the cord. But in Part 4, we will witness the act itself, the moment where silk met flesh, where ambition conquered blood, and where the Ottoman dynasty preserved itself through its most chilling ritual. Stay with us as we step into the shadowed chamber and see how an empire sustained its might by destroying its own heart. The corridors of the Topkapi Palace were built to muffle sound, a deliberate design, for behind those marble walls and gilded doors, the empire's darkest work unfolded in silence. It was in these quiet, suffocating spaces that the Ottoman Sultans secured their rule, not by speeches or decrees, but by the tightening of silk cords around the throats of their own brothers. And now we step into that chamber of shadows to witness what so few have seen, and what no chronicler dared describe in full. The hour has come. The Sultan's order, whispered in the language of inevitability, has reached the executioners. These men, dressed in plain tunics of deep blue or black, their faces expressionless, their steps measured, move as extensions of the Sultan's will. They are not monsters, they are instruments, and in their hands the silk cord gleams faintly in the torchlight, a beautiful tool for an ugly task. The condemned prince waits, though he does not know for certain. Perhaps he hears the soft footfalls approaching down the corridor. Perhaps he prays or paces, or sits staring at the latticework of his chamber window, watching the world he will soon leave behind. The door opens, the executioners enter. No words are spoken. There is no proclamation, no accusation, no pretense of trial. The prince understands at once. His body tenses, his breath quickens. In that instant, he passes from brother to threat, from prince to prey. The executioners act swiftly, with precision honed over generations. The cord loops around the prince's neck silk so as not to spill royal blood, but no less deadly for its softness. A tug, firm and practiced. The prince struggles, instinctively grasping at the cord, at the hands that hold it, at anything. His feet scrape against the marble floor, his eyes wide with terror, pleading with men who cannot grant mercy. The room fills with the sounds of the struggle, the rasp of silk drawn tight, the muffled gasps, the thud of a body collapsing. But only for a moment. The executioners know their craft well. Death comes not quickly, but surely. The prince's face darkens, his limbs twitch, and then stillness. Outside, the palace goes on as if nothing has happened. The Sultan receives ambassadors, signs decrees, hears petitions. The great machine of empire turns, blind and deaf to the sacrifice it demands. One by one, if there are multiple brothers, the ritual repeats. Each prince brought from his chamber, each life ended with the same cold efficiency. The executioners do not falter. The cords are coiled again, ready for the next. The Sultan's will must be carried out to its bitter end. Consider Sultan Mehmed III again, the prince who ordered the death of his 19 brothers upon ascending the throne. 19 sons of the same bloodline, their lives ended in a single night. The bodies were wrapped in fine cloth, carried out through hidden passages to quiet tombs, buried without ceremony or name. The mothers of these princes, their wails silenced by the weight of custom and terror, were left to grieve in shadows. But the act was not only physical. The psychological toll was immense on the mothers who could not protect their children, on the executioners who bore the stain of bloodless murder, and on the Sultan himself, who wore the crown heavy with the knowledge that he reigned over the corpses of his kin. And the city? The city saw nothing. The people gathered for the Sultan's coronation, cheered the procession of janissaries, marveled at the splendor of ceremonies, oblivious to the price paid in the palace's inner sanctum. For the empire's strength, they believed, was unshakable. Few considered the rivers of unseen blood that nourished its roots. The silk cord, so often depicted in art and legend, became a symbol of this hidden violence, beautiful in its craftsmanship, deadly in its purpose. To touch it was to touch the heart of Ottoman power, soft on the surface, unyielding beneath. The executioners, once their grim work was done, disappeared again into the palace's silent machinery. Their names were rarely recorded, their faces forgotten, their hands clean in the eyes of law, though bloodless murder leaves its own invisible stains. And what of the Sultan? He emerged from his seclusion, his rule secured, his court gathered in loyal submission. But in his heart he carried the weight of those he had destroyed, a weight that no crown could lighten, no victory erase. In Part 4, we have seen the act itself. The silk cord drawn tight, the breath stolen from royal lungs, the empire preserved at the cost of its own blood. But in Part 5, we will trace the legacy of this practice, how fratricide shaped the Ottoman state, scarred its rulers, and left a shadow that lingers in the memory of history. Join us as we explore the aftermath of royal fratricide, the price of survival, and the ghostly echoes of brothers slain for the sake of empire. The cords had long been coiled, the chambers swept clean, the bodies of the princes laid to rest beneath cold slabs of unmarked stone. But the silence that followed fratricide within the Topkapi Palace was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a wound too deep to heal, of an empire that had secured itself by tearing at its own flesh. And though the sultans ruled on, their thrones gleamed with gold and their banners flew high, the shadows of their fallen brothers never left them. What, then, was the cost of this grim custom? What mark did it leave on the Ottoman Empire, its rulers, its people, and on history itself? At first glance, fratricide seemed to work. The bloodletting at the dawn of each new reign brought stability. The chaos of the Ottoman interregnum, that nightmare of brotherly civil war, did not repeat itself. The empire expanded, flourished, and dominated. From the conquests of Selim the Grim to the golden age of Suleiman the Magnificent, the dynasty's iron grip on succession kept its enemies at bay and its armies strong. But beneath the surface, the practice scarred the dynasty and the state. The very act that aimed to prevent civil war created a court culture poisoned by fear, distrust, and paranoia. A sultan who had ordered the death of his own brothers could trust no one fully, not his viziers, not his janissaries, not even his son. For if he had killed to gain power, might not others do the same to take it from him? The mothers of the princes, women who might have been the empire's stabilizing force, lived in terror, their influence twisted by the knowledge that their children's lives hung on the whims of court politics. The harem, rather than being a sanctuary, became a cage of plots and desperate alliances, each concubine striving to protect her son or advance his claim at any cost. Over time, the relentless violence at the heart of succession began to sap the strength it was meant to secure. Some sultans, haunted by the blood on their hands, withdrew into isolation or indulgence, leaving governance to viziers and court factions. Others became consumed by suspicion, purging not only their kin but also capable ministers and generals. The machinery of empire ground on, but its gears became clogged with intrigue and fear. The Ottoman people, meanwhile, saw only glimpses of these dark truths. The empire's historians, bound by duty or fear, wrote of glorious reigns, wise decrees, and divine justice. The stranglings in the palace were whispered of, but never officially recorded in full detail. The blood price of stability remained an unspoken secret known, accepted, but rarely acknowledged. Yet the shadow of fratricide reached even beyond the palace walls. It became part of the empire's reputation in the world, feeding both awe and horror. European chroniclers spoke of the Sultan's ruthlessness, painting the Ottomans as both mighty and monstrous. Diplomats tread carefully, knowing that behind the splendor of courtly receptions lurked a ruler who had ordered the deaths of his own kin. Over time, as the empire aged and the challenges it faced grew more complex, the practice of fratricide itself began to change. The 17th century saw the rise of the Kafes, or cage, a system in which princes were no longer executed at once, but confined for life in isolated palace apartments. This was seen as a more merciful alternative, but it carried its own dark consequences. Princes raised in the cage emerged as sultans ignorant of the world, unskilled in governance, and often mentally broken by years of isolation. The empire they inherited suffered for it. By the 18th century, the custom of killing brothers had all but vanished, replaced by confinement and exile. The dynasty no longer had the stomach for so much blood, and the world had changed. Enlightenment ideals crept even into the Ottoman court. Yet the legacy of centuries of fratricide could not so easily be erased. The fear, the distrust, the wounds left by generations of royal bloodshed lingered, shaping the politics and culture of the empire to its very end. And today, the marble corridors of the Topkapi Palace are quiet now. Tourists walk where executioners once crept, and the chambers where princes met their end stand empty, their secrets lost to time. Yet the story of Ottoman fratricide endures a chilling reminder of what price rulers will pay for power and what cost a state will demand for stability. It challenges us to ask, how far can any system go in the name of order before it destroys its own soul? Can peace, bought by blood, ever truly last? And do the shadows of such choices ever truly fade? The Ottoman Empire, for all its glories, carried these questions at its heart, and they echo still in the ruins of its palaces, in the pages of its history, and in the memory of a world that watched in fear and wonder as brothers became enemies and rulers became prisoners of their own power. As we close this chapter of dark history, the story of Ottoman fratricide stands as a stark lesson that power, when gripped too tightly, can crush not only its enemies, but itself. But the shadows of history do not end here. In our next exploration, we will uncover another tale from the abyss, perhaps the secret assassins of Persia, or the cursed treasures that doomed kings and kingdoms alike. So subscribe, share, and stay with us as we journey deeper into the hidden horrors of the past. The darkness is vast, and we have only begun to explore its depths.